Welcome to Introduction to Sedimentation and Stratigraphy. I'm Dr. William Patterson. Today we'll be talking about shallow marine carbonate and evaporite environments. Part 1 of 3, Carbonate and Evaporite Deposition. Today we're here to talk about shallow marine carbonate and evaporite environments. Limestones are common sedimentary rocks that are primarily formed in shallow marine depositional environments. Most of the calcium carbonate in limestone comes from biological sources ranging from the hard, shelly parts of invertebrates such as mollusks to very fine particles of calcite and aragonite formed by algae. The accumulation of sediment in carbonate-forming environments is largely controlled by factors that influence the types and abundances of organisms that live in them. Water depth, temperature, salinity, nutrient availability, and the supply of terrigenous clastic material all influence carbonate deposition and accumulation of limestones. Some depositional environments are created by organisms, such as reefs built by sedentary colonial organisms such as corals. Changes in biota through geological time have also played an important role in determining the characteristics of shallow marine sediments through the stratigraphic record. In arid environments, carbonate sedimentation may be associated with evaporite successions formed by the chemical precipitation of gypsum, anhydrite, and halite from the evaporation of seawater. Shallow marine environments can be sites for the formation of exceptionally thick evaporite sequences, sometimes referred to as saline giants. These have no modern equivalents. There are a number of features of shallow marine carbonate environments that are distinctive compared to those of terrigenous clastic depositional environments. First, they're largely composed of sedimentary material that is formed in situ, mainly by biological processes. They are therefore not affected by external processes that influence the supply of detritus, except where increased terrigenous clastic supply reduces carbonate productivity, that is to say, the rate of formation of calcium carbonate by biological processes. Secondly, grain size is generally determined by biological processes that precipitate material, not by the strength of wave or current action, although these processes may break up clasts during reworking. Thirdly, biological processes can determine characteristics of the environment, principally in places where reef formation strongly controls the distribution of energy regimes. And lastly, production of carbonate by organisms is rapid in geological terms. It occurs at rates that can commonly keep pace with changes in water depth that are due to tectonic subsidence or eustatic sea level rises. This has important consequences for the formation of depositional sequences. Shallow marine carbonates are deposited on carbonate platforms that occur in a wide variety of climatic and tectonic settings, provided that two main conditions are met. First, isolation from clastic supply, and second, they should be shallow marine waters. Carbonate grains deposited and the facies they generate are generally controlled by climatic conditions, and they have varied over time as different groups of organisms evolve. As organisms change, the debris they leave behind will change. Carbonate platforms accumulate according to tectonic and sea level controls on the shape and depth of sedimentary basins. Tectonic subsidence factors also strongly influence the stratigraphy of successions on carbonate platforms. In considering isolation from clastic supply, this is critical for the formation of carbonate platforms, as the supply of calcium carbonate in an environment should have a low supply of terrigenous clastic and volcanoclastic material. Otherwise, the carbonate gets diluted by these terrigenous clasts and volcanic clasts. Clastic supply to shallow marine environments can be limited by both tectonic and climatic factors. Most terrigenous sediment is supplied to shallow seas by rivers, and the pathways of fluvial systems are controlled by the distribution of areas of uplift and subsidence on the continents. On most continents, the bulk of the drainage is concentrated into a small number of very large rivers that funnel sediment to coastal deltas. Along coastlines distant from these deltas, the clastic supply is generally low, with only relatively small river systems supplying detritus. This results in extensive regions that receive little to no terrigenous sandy or muddy sediment. The climate of the continent adjacent to the shelf also plays a significant role. In desert regions, rainfall and therefore runoff is very low. This results in minimal fluvial transport of sediment to the sea or to a lake. Biogenic carbonate production is inhibited by the presence of clastic material such that areas of low detrital input are potential sites for carbonate deposition. Under favorable conditions, the amount of biogenic carbonate produced in shallow seas is determined by the productivity within the food web. Photosynthetic plants, such as algae at the bottom of the food chain, are dependent on the availability of light, and the penetration by sunlight is controlled in turn by water depth and the amount of suspended material in the sea. Relatively shallow waters with minimal suspended terrigenous clastic material are therefore most favorable. In tropical regions with clear waters, this photic zone may extend to 100 meters depth. Photosynthetic organisms, however, typically thrive in the upper 10 to 20 meters of the oceans, and it is in this zone that the greatest abundance of calcareous organisms will be found. This shallow region of high biogenic productivity is referred to as the carbonate factory. Increased or reduced salinity will inhibit productivity, and the optimum temperature is usually between 20 and 25 degrees centigrade. Hermatypic corals, dependent on symbiotic algae, are the most productive in shallow, clear water with strong currents, while most other benthic marine organisms prefer quieter waters. Precipitation of evaporite minerals, particularly calcium sulfates, including gypsum and anhydrite, as well as sodium chloride or halite, occurs when bodies of seawater become partially or completely isolated from the open ocean under arid conditions. The main factor in production of evaporite deposits is climate, because the seawater can become sufficiently concentrated for precipitation to occur only if the rate of loss through evaporation exceeds the input of water. Such arid environments are usually located in subtropical regions where mean annual temperatures are relatively high while rainfall is relatively low. Modern marine evaporite deposits are found in coastal settings where precipitation occurs in semi-isolated bodies of water, such as in lagoons or directly within sediments of the coastal plain, places where recharge by seawater is limited. On geological timescales, larger areas of evaporite precipitation resulted from the isolation from the open ocean of epicontinental seas and small ocean basins. The term carbonate platform is usually applied to any shallow marine environment where carbonate sediment accumulates. If the platform is adjacent to a continental landmass, it is known as a carbonate shelf, a region of sedimentation that is analogous to shelf environments for terrigenous clastic deposition. A carbonate shelf may receive a limited supply of material from the adjacent landmass. Carbonate banks are isolated platforms that are completely surrounded by deep water and therefore do not receive any terrigenous clastic supply. A carbonate atoll is a particular class of carbonate bank formed above a subsiding volcanic island. Three morphologies of carbonate platform are therefore recognized. They may be flat-topped with a sharp change in slope at the edge, forming a steep margin, either as a rimmed or non-rimmed shelf, or they may have a ramp morphology, a gentle, typically less than 1 degree slope down to deeper water with no break in slope. The relative abundance of the different carbonate-forming organisms has varied considerably through geologic time. Compared to terrigenous clastic facies in shallow marine environments, the characteristics of shallow marine carbonate facies depend on the time period in which they were deposited. Most significantly, the absence of abundant shelly organisms in the Precambrian means that carbonate facies from this time are markedly different from Phanerozoic deposits in that they lack bioclastic components. They lack the chunks of the Phanerozoic. Skeletal grain associations on carbonate platforms are temperature and salinity dependent. At low latitudes where shallow seas are always warmer than 15 degrees centigrade and the salinity is always normal, corals and calcareous green algae are common, and along with other numerous organisms, form a chlorazone assemblage, known as a reef track. In restricted seas where the salinities are higher, only green algae flourish and form a chloralgal association, such as in Florida Bay. Temperate carbonates formed in cooler waters are dominated by the remains of benthic foraminifera and mollusks, known as a foramal assemblage. Ooids are most commonly associated with chlorazoan and chloralgal assemblages. Patterns of sedimentation along high-energy coastlines with carbonate sedimentation are very similar to those of clastic wave-dominated coastlines. Carbonate material in the form of bioclastic debris in ooids is reworked by wave action into ridges that form strand planes along the coast or barrier islands separated from the shore by a lagoon. The texture of carbonate sediment deposited on barrier islands and strand planes is typically well sorted with a low mud matrix content. These would be known as grainstones and packstones. Few organisms live in the high-energy foreshore zone such that all the carbonate detritus is reworked from the shore face. Sedimentary structures are low angle, 3 to 13 degrees, cross stratification dipping seaward on the foreshore and landward in the backshore area. Barrier islands formed of carbonate sediment form in microtidal regimes where they occur as laterally continuous barriers parallel to the shoreline. In common with barriers made up of terrigenous clastic material, They form in response to a slow rise in sea level. An important difference between beaches made of terrigenous clastic material and carbonate-rich beaches is the formation of beach rock in the latter. Low magnesium calcite precipitates between sand and gravel material deposited on the beach and cements the beach sediment into a fully lithified rock. Beach rock along the foreshore may act as a host for organisms that bore into the hard substrate, a feature that may make it possible to recognize early cementation of a beach rock in the stratigraphic record. Prograding strand plane or barrier island generates a coarsening upward succession of well-sorted, stratified greenstone and packstone. These deposits are typically associated with lagoonal, supertidal, and inner shelf ramp facies. At the top of the beach, sands composed of bioclastic and other carbonate detritus may be reworked by wind to form aeolian dunes. When these dune sands become wet, calcium carbonate is locally dissolved and reprecipitated to cement the material at the surface into a rock, which is often referred to as an aeolianite. Carbonate also precipitates around the roots of vegetation growing in the dune sands and may be preserved as nodular rhizocretions. Lagoons form along carbonate coastlines where a beach barrier partially or completely encloses an area of shallow water. The character of the lagoon deposit depends on the salinity of the water, and this in turn is determined by two factors: the degree of connection with the open ocean and the aridity of the climate. In carbonate lagoons, fine-grained sedimentation forms layers of carbonate mudstone and waxstone with some grainstone and packstone beds deposited as washovers near the beach barrier. Where a barrier island ridge is cut by tidal channels in a mesotidal regime, the tidal currents passing through form flood and ebb tidal deltas, in much the same way as in a clastic barrier island system. The shape and internal sedimentary structures of these deposits are also similar on both clastic and carbonate coastlines, with lenses of cross-bedded oolitic and bioclastic packstone and grainstone formed by subaqueous dunes on flood tidal deltas. The nature of the carbonate material deposited on ebb and flood tidal deltas depends on the type of material produced in the shallow marine waters. This material may be bioclastic debris or, less commonly, oolitic sediment forming beds of grainstone and packstone. In hot, dry climates, the loss of water by evaporation from the surface of a lagoon is high. If it's not balanced by influx of fresh water from the land or exchange of water with the ocean, the salinity of the lagoon will rise and it will become hypersaline, more concentrated in salts than normal seawater. An area of hypersaline shallow water that precipitates evaporite materials is known as a saltern. Deposits are typically layered gypsum and or halite, occurring in units that are meters to tens of meters thick. In the restricted circulation of a lagoon, conditions are right for large crystals of gypsum, known as selenite, to form by growing upwards from the lagoon bed. Connection with the ocean may be via gaps in the barrier or by seepage through it. Variations in the salinity within the lagoon may be because of climatically related changes in the freshwater influx from the land or increased exchange with open seawater during periods of higher sea level. The extent of the lagoon and the minerals precipitated in it are therefore likely to be variable, resulting in cycles of sedimentation, including layers of carbonate deposited during periods when salinity was closer to normal marine values. An alteration between laminated gypsum deposited subaqueously in the lagoon and nodular gypsum formed in a supertidal sabkha around the edges of the water body may represent fluctuations in the area of the water body. The supertidal zone lies above the mean high water mark and is only inundated by seawater under exceptional circumstances, such as very high tides and storm conditions. Where the gradient to the shoreline is very low, the supertidal zone is a marshy area where microtidal or microbial mats may form from algae and bacteria. Aeolian action may also bring in carbonate sand and dust that is bound by the microbes, and as syn-depositional cementation occurs, a hard carbonate pavement is formed. Desiccation breaks up the pavement, but the broken pieces of crust are reincorporated into the sediment again as further cementation occurs. The fabric created shows some primary lamination, but also appears to be brecciated. It's important to note, however, that these breccias form in situ and do not involve transport of the clasts. They break up in place. Arid shorelines are today found in places such as the Arabian Gulf, where evaporites form within the coastal sediment. These arid coasts are called sabkhas. They typically have very low relief, where well-defined beaches are rare. The coastal plain of a sabkha is occasionally wetted by seawater during very high tides or during onshore storm winds, but more important is also a supply of water through groundwater seepage from the sea. The surface of the coastal plain is an area of evaporation, and water is drawn up through the sediment to the surface. As the water rises, it becomes more concentrated in salts that precipitate within the coastal plain sediment, and a dense, highly concentrated brine is formed. Gypsum and anhydrite grow within the sediment while a crust of halite forms at the surface. In these arid Sabkha flats, generally, anhydrite forms in the hotter, drier Sabkhas, and gypsum where the temperatures are lower or where there's a supply of fresh continental water to the Sabkha. Both gypsum and anhydrite are formed in some Sabkhas. Close to the shore in the intertidal and near supertidal zone, gypsum crystals grow in the relatively high flux of seawater through the sediment, whereas further up in the supertidal area, conditions are drier and nodules of anhydrite will form in the sediment. The gypsum and anhydrite grow by displacement within the sediment, with the gypsum in clusters and anhydrite forming amorphous coalesced nodules with little original sediment in between. These layers of anhydrite with remnants of other sediment have a characteristic chicken wire structure. Halite crusts are rarely preserved because they are removed by any surface water flows. The terrigenous sediment of the Sabkha is often red in oxidizing conditions. The succession formed by sedimentation along an arid coast starts with beds deposited in a wave-reworked shallow subtidal setting overlain by intertidal microbial limestone beds. Gypsum formed in the upper intertidal and lower supertidal area occurs next in succession, in turn overlain by anhydrite with a chicken wire structure. Coalesced beds of anhydrite formed in the uppermost part of the Sabkha form layers that contort as minerals have grown. This is known as enterolithic bedding structure. This cycle may be repeated many times if there's a continued subsidence along the coastal plain. The displacive growth of the gypsum within the sediment is a distinctive feature of Sabkhas, which allows the deposits of these arid coasts to be distinguished from other marine evaporite deposits. Similar evaporite growth occurs within continental sediments in arid regions. Tidal currents along carbonate-dominated coastlines transport and deposit coarse sediment in tidal channels and carbonate mud on tidal flats. Tidal channel sediments are similar in character to those found in tidal channels in clastic estuarine deposits. The base of the channel succession is marked by an erosive base overlain by a lag of coarse debris that may consist of broken shells and interclasts of lithified carbonate sediment. Carbonate sands deposited on migrating bars in the tidal channels form cross-bedded grainstone and packstone beds. As a channel migrates or is abandoned, the sands are overlain by finer sediment, forming beds of carbonate mudstone and waxstone. Bioturbation is common throughout. In the intertidal zones, deposits of lime mud and shelly mud are subject to subaerial desiccation at low tides. Terrigenous clastic mud remains relatively wet when exposed between tidal cycles, but carbonate mud tends to dry out in warm climates and form a crust by syndepositional cementation. Repeated precipitation of cements in this crust causes the surface layer to expand and form a polygonal pattern of ridges called teepee structures or pseudo-anticlines, a few tens of centimeters across. As the pseudo-anticlines grow, they leave cavities behind them that become sites for the growth of sparry calcite cement. Smaller, isolated cavities and vertically elongate hollow tubes also form in lime muds in intertidal areas due to air and water being trapped in the sediment during the wetting and drying process. Patches of calcite sediment that grow in the cavities in the host lime mud give rise to a fabric generally called fenestrae, or fenestral cavities, after the German word for window, Fenster. Lime mudstones with small cavities filled with calcite are sometimes called bird's eye limestone. The lithified crust can be reworked by storms and redeposited elsewhere. A common feature of carbonate tidal flats is the formation of algal and bacterial mats that trap fine-grained sediment in thin layers, forming well-developed fine lamination of a stromatolite. Stromatolites may form horizontal layers or irregular mounds on the tidal flats. Their distribution is partly controlled by the activity of organisms that either feed on the microbial mats or disrupt the microbial mats by bioturbation. Stromatolites tend to be better developed in the higher parts of the intertidal area that are less favorable for other organisms that may graze on the mats. Basically, they thrive where the environment is too hostile for things to survive, things that would eat them. Characteristics of deposits in shallow marine carbonate environments are determined by the types of organisms present and the energy from waves and tidal currents. Sources of the carbonate material are predominantly biogenic, including mud from algae and bacteria, sand-sized bioclasts, ooids, and peloids, along with gravelly debris that is skeletal or formed from interclasts. Bioturbation is usually very common, and fecal pellets contribute to the sediment. A number of different carbonate deposits are characteristic of many shallow marine environments, such as shoals of sand-sized material, reefs, and mud mounds. In carbonate sand shoals, sediment composed of sand to granule-sized loose carbonate material occurs in shallow, high-energy areas. These carbonate shoals may be made of ooids, mixtures of broken shelly debris, or accumulations of benthic foraminifera. Reworking by wave and tidal currents results in deposits made up of well-sorted, well-rounded material. When lithified, these beds form grainstone and sometimes packstone. Sedimentary structures may be similar to those found in sand bodies on clastic shelves, including planar and trough cross-bedding generated by the migration of subaqueous dune bed forms. However, the degree of reworking is often limited by early carbonate cementation. So this is a very active chemical environment where grains have the potential of being glued together very quickly. Extensive wave action tends to break up shoals that form banks parallel to the coastline, whereas tidal currents in coastal regions result in bodies of sediment elongated perpendicular to the shoreline.